celebrating Juneteenth. So my name is Chelsey Coleman. I am part of our community relations team here at the Aquarium of the Pacific, and I've had the immense pleasure of working with Baba the Storyteller for the past little bit, especially for our African American Festival. And I don't know about you guys sitting here with me in the theater, but I've gotten a little bit relaxed and mellow just listening to him play music, so I think we'll let him play for just a little bit longer.
Thank you, Chelsey. Nadiera mugomina ude kuyerina nakuyera mugomina tumbadieri naro diera mugomina jelia diera babana Jalilu bulila Ure walale, finalu ulila, ure waifu, jalo dendigo ulila, ure wala bungafe, ye bungavo, iri bulura jeliala, mane selala
That was beautiful.
Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you all for being here.
So can you tell us a little bit about the instrument that you were using? I know it's pretty important in the traditional storytelling that you do, right?
Yeah, the instrument is actually, it's a very, let me see, it dates back hundreds of years. So the instrument is called a kora, and the kora is one of many instruments that the oral historians of West Africa play. The French call them griots. Mm-hmm. In the language of Bamana, they call themselves djeli or djali. And they were the griots were the living, breathing libraries of the people because it was an oral culture. So everything was passed by mouth to ear. And the griots memorized the genealogy, the names of the people, the history of the people. And this is one of the instruments that was used to recite the history, to sing the history, not just talk and tell the history, but to sing it and share with the people.
I see. So I know that Juneteenth has kind of come into prominence a lot more in recent history, but it's been celebrated for quite some time, right?
Oh my goodness, yeah. Juneteenth, and actually the Juneteenth that we're celebrating is based out of Texas, right? Mm-hmm. But these freedom days, emancipation days that occurred in 1865, it was actually celebrated all over the country. These were celebrations all over the country. In fact, the earliest one was actually in DC, I believe. And
really?
And yeah, it was one of the earliest Freedom Day celebrations. But this is the one that has gained the most prominence in this country, yeah.
Now you were telling me you grew up celebrating a little bit as well, right?
Okay, yeah, okay, I have to be honest. I have to be honest with you. I grew up in Texas, mm-hmm. And yes, we celebrated Juneteenth, but I don't think I matured into the understanding of Juneteenth until I was about 11 or 12. Prior to that, the only thing that my childish mind enjoyed about Juneteenth or understood was that I got to eat red velvet cake and strawberry soda together. And for a child to be able to consume that much sugar in one sitting, that was, but around 11, I began to mature to understand what Juneteenth was really about. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's incredible, because it is a pretty layered holiday, if I remember correctly, right?
It's a pretty what?
Layered?
Oh my goodness. Yeah, layered is an understatement. Layered is an understatement because the Juneteenth that we celebrate today, the narratives shift, mm-hmm. but the popular narrative deals with the state of Texas and the period of enslavement where many people were suffering through slavery. And it was when the Emancipation Proclamation came out, the popular narrative says that the people in Texas, specifically Galveston, weren't made aware of the Emancipation Proclamation for 2 years, that the news didn't reach them. But that's the popular narrative, which I don't quite agree with. What I understand, having grown up and studied the history of my people in that area, is everyone was well aware of the Emancipation Proclamation. And I can't remember who said it, and I want to give them credit for it. It was that news doesn't travel slowly, power does. And I can't remember who said that, but that was more of what was happening at that time. But they knew they were free. The people of Galveston, the enslaved, knew they were free.
Now, I know from the little bit that I know about the holiday, it wasn't just an American holiday, right? It was also celebrated a little bit in Mexico.
Oh, yeah, you've been doing a little research. Here's what brings that all together. In the 1830s, cotton was king. It was the major industry in the South. In fact, it was the majority of this country's economic fuel. It's what fueled the economy, cotton. And the people, they were having all these controversies over the expansion of enslavement of people. And Texas was an area where, actually it was Mexico at the time. And many of the Europeans wanted to expand their plantation system, the growing of cotton, and bringing slaves into Texas. But Texas was a part of Mexico at the time, and Mexico did not tolerate slavery. So there was this conflict between the European settlers that came in and and those of Mexican descent. And there was negotiations made between, getting into the weeds now, I don't want to do that to everybody, but there was a negotiation made between Steve Austin, who they say is the father of Texas, and the Mexican authorities, that they would allow slavery for a certain period of time, but it needed to be phased out. Needless to say, someone didn't honor their part of that 1830-something agreement. But yeah, you've researched before coming here. I like that.
Well, I'll hold off from the heavier stuff, but I do want to circle back around to what you were saying about red velvet cake and strawberry soda.
Yeah.
Now, can you tell us a little bit why those are so significant? Because those sound delicious.
I'm gonna share this. I'll tell you this. I have my own theories, but what I'll do is I'll explain first what many of the people say in their own words.
Sounds good.
So red velvet cake, if we go back during the time of 1865, was a luxury. And it was a luxury that only white people consumed, right? And this is the popular narrative around red velvet cake. And that when the enslaved were free and came forward, that they began to enjoy many of the luxuries of the slave masters, because we felt like we had worked for it, we earned it. So the popular narrative is the consumption of red velvet cake was about that. Now, do you want to know my theory?
Of course I do.
Okay. Humor me on this one. Because I've traveled all over the world, and I've traveled to areas of what we call the diaspora, areas where Africans were taken in different parts of the world, from Brazil to Cuba to parts of Europe, Western Europe. What I've noticed is that enslaved people who traveled throughout all of these different areas were not empty vessels, right? Even though much of their culture was not permitted to be practiced, they found ways to practice it. So, for example, in Cuba, you have these religions called Santeria, Lucumi. In Brazil, you have something called Candomblé. In Uruguay, you have Candomblé, all these religions. But what they did was they took the Catholic saints and renamed them.
Okay.
And reformed them and reshaped them. So when the white slave masters were around, those saints had the names that the Christians applied to them. But when they weren't around, many of those became names like Shango or Watala, or different religions that had been practiced in Africa, they kept here. Now, a circuitous route to tell you about red velvet cake. Red was always an important color. And the people of Galveston, the people back at this time, were very religious in a way we can't quite understand, because their spirituality, their religion, is what kept them and so help them to survive through enslavement. That color red, in many places, the reason why I believe it's a part of Juneteenth is because it's also the color of sacrament. And they included everything from the Bible and their religious practices in everything they did. So I believe that they were holding on to aspects of their culture that had been attempted to be taken away or erased, because you can't. Human beings don't let go of who they are.
Right.
They just don't. So for me, when I'm celebrating the color red, I recognize the blood of my ancestors. I recognize those who have sacrificed so that I could be here. And I have to believe that those early people who celebrated Juneteenth were the same, because every institution that they created at the end of enslavement during Reconstruction had the word African attached to it. African Methodist Episcopal Church, African Church, African Society. They actually saw themselves as African in a lot of ways, and we're far removed from it, but that's just a little bit about the red, the color red. So those two theories, people can, I hope that helps gain some insight into how that works.
I think it gives us a lot to think about in the way that, I mean, anybody looking to hold on to who they are, they're going to work within whatever system is in place and kind of make it work for them if they can, I think, is what you're saying, right?
Yeah, I get questions about Juneteenth. I mean, I've always gotten these questions, and I've reached the point now where I probably have more patience than I've ever had in my life. There's something about getting old that slows you down, right? I have more patience than I've ever had, and I'm a grandfather. So I get questions such as, you know, is Juneteenth for everyone? Can Juneteenth be celebrated by people not part of the culture? Can Juneteenth be celebrated by white people? And rather than use my own words, my wife is a 5th grade teacher. I'm going to use the words of one of her 5th grade students.
Okay.
This child, this was prophetic to me, said, and my wife was teaching them about Juneteenth. This child said, anyone who understands the privilege of history will celebrate Juneteenth.
Wow. From a 5th grader?
A 5th grade child. Did y'all hear that? That was an 11-year-old boy who said that. So, from the mouths of babes, as they say.
I mean, you said 5th grader, and I was sitting here thinking, oh, good, something at my level, but he's far surpassed me. I mean, I've even run into a few questions telling people about this event, and I think people are wondering sometimes, is it a celebratory event? Is it more somber? And people are a little bit confused if they've never heard about it before.
Yeah, think of it this way. It is whatever you make it. Because Juneteenth is really about freedom, right? And the expression of freedom. So at this time, you know, you have to think about this. Like there's a story in my family. I'm very fortunate because when I was growing up, I got to spend time around my great-grandfather. And my great-grandfather lived to be 110. My great-grandfather's mother and father were both born into slavery. So I'm a descendant of those people who at one time were enslaved. But there's this story in our family, and this goes back to this idea of freedom. When my great-grandfather left from the plantation he worked, and when he knew he had been released from the bondage of enslavement, there's a story that he walked for miles to the highest mountain he could find. This was in Alabama. And he climbed, and when he got to the top, he screamed, and he continued screaming until he lost his voice. And for him, that was an expression of freedom. That was an expression of him letting out all the pain that he had been through, right? But if I ask 20 people, what is freedom to you? You're going to get 20 different answers. So I think that's where this idea of, well, what really is Juneteenth? It's about freedom and the expression of freedom. So however you choose to acknowledge, to celebrate, to articulate your freedom, that's Juneteenth. It really, I mean, there's some historical things that we can get into. We can have those conversations. But really, it's the moment in this nation's history where everyone can claim that the ideals expressed in the Constitution that we're actually moving toward, because at that point, everyone was free. Well, I'm not going to get into the historical weeds here, but you know that's the whole idea behind it. So I would say freedom of expression.
And that's so important. I think it's really interesting you bring up your great-grandfather. I was lucky enough to actually go see mine yesterday, and he is 102. And I'm lucky enough that I do get to hear all of the stories that he has from, fighting in World War II, from when he grew up before everything was settled. And he was telling us about his time here in Los Angeles before it was developed. But that just reminds me of what you were talking about, of the importance of oral history and oral tradition, because I never would have heard those stories firsthand just trying to find it in a library.
You do know what a gift that is, don't
I do.
you?
I'm so very lucky.
Yeah, I didn't realize that was a gift until I was much older. And if I'm being okay, we have to be honest, right? Okay, so if I'm being honest, when I was young, I didn't appreciate spending that kind of time with my great-grandfather. But the reason why my family did it, in down south, and there's this, I was born with what's called a widow's peak. Do you know what a widow's peak is?
Yes, I have one too.
Okay. Down south, in the some of the African-American community, anyone, when I was born, a baby, this made my grandmother so happy. Anyone born with a widow's peak was destined to become a minister.
Oh, okay.
That was just part of the old wives' tales, part of the, if you want to call it tradition, part of the superstition, whatever you want to call it. So when many of my cousins, when we would go to my great-grandfather's farm, all the kids would go out and play, and I wasn't allowed to. I had to go sit in a room with my great-grandfather for hours at a time. And when I was young, I didn't appreciate it. But if I could have that time now, if I could have that time now.
Well, they say hindsight is 20/20, right?
Yeah.
And actually, I was going to say we should take a minute and probably explain these photos that we have coming up behind us. They've been circling for a little bit.
Yeah, I wanted to make sure that we had these images projected out, because when we talk about Juneteenth, when we talk about the Civil War, some of the narrative around it is a little off-putting to me, because what happens typically in history in this country is black people, African Americans, are stripped of agency. A lot of times, if you listen to the history as it's put out, we're these passive beings waiting for history to be brought to us, right? Or waiting for someone to free us. And I think it's a mischaracterization of human potential. Because here, I'm gonna just give you this as an example, and talking about these images. The Emancipation Proclamation, for example, right? I recently was at a school, and there was a child, an adorable child. I think he was second grade, he's about second grade. And he said, he raised his hand because we were talking about Juneteenth and all these things. And he was so proud because he said, Baba, and I said, yeah? He said, Lincoln freed the slaves. And this is what he was taught. This is what he's learned. Now, I'm not going to go to an 8 or 9-year-old child and say, wait a minute, let me correct you.
Right.
So I approached him where he was, right? And I just let him know, I said, Lincoln had a lot of help. Do you want to know who helped Lincoln? He said, who helped Lincoln free the slaves? I said, the enslaved people. They helped Lincoln a lot. And they freed themselves. And I told him my uncles, my family members, there were over 200,000 soldiers, black men, who fought in the Civil War. And I don't think we have enough monuments to them. They sacrificed. These soldiers belong to, when they finally let it, this is an interesting image. This one is interesting. I'll get back to the soldiers in a second. But this image is of what they call stevedores. These were people who transported supplies for the Union.
Okay.
For the Union. Now, before soldiers came in, there were these people who were escaping over to the Union side from enslavement. And at one point, they began to call them contraband.
Oh.
Contraband. Because what was happening is the Confederacy was using these enslaved peoples to build embankments, encampments, and support their cause. But they were running away to the other side, escaping, which is a form of resistance, which we need to consider. And they began to call them contraband. So they would not return them to the Confederacy, even though they had been enslaved. Because at one time they would have, but they began not to return them. And these people began to work for the Union, digging ditches, trenches, transporting, everything that needed to be done. And these are images we're fortunate to have of these people, but we don't see them enough. We need to see these images more. Now, back to the soldiers, back to the soldiers. It wasn't only about the 200,000 Black men who fought, because there was a concerted effort to bring down the Confederacy. There were men, women, and children who served as spies for the Union, who served behind Confederate lines. Children, we don't talk about this enough, children who took information they heard and passed it on to their parents, because the Confederacy looked down on Black folks as less than human. So they felt free talking in front of them, saying things. And much of the war was shifted because of the way that they engaged as spies. So these are some of those people. And you'll see on here some images of like groups of families of men, women, and children. Those are some of the people I'm talking about.
I think the way you answered that boy's question was very kind of you. And to, like you said, to meet him where he was at. And I think, I mean, personally, I can remember starting history classes in college and having them be very different than the history classes and things that we were taught in elementary and middle and high school. And I think the more you grow up, the more you realize it's not so cut and dry, I guess.
You're talking about sanitized versions of history.
Yeah, exactly. Because like you meant, I never knew that there were children involved in the resistance efforts, like you were mentioning.
I think we have sanitized versions of history for a lot of reasons, but I think one of them is human beings try to protect their psyches from trauma. The brain does not want to engage trauma at all. And what happens is once we are forced to face something, we don't have the ability to walk away from it. We face it, it becomes a part of our psyche, and if we don't deal with it, it haunts us, right? And I think what happens now is people have this what psychologists call experiential avoidance.
Okay.
They want to avoid the unpleasantness of history.
And being uncomfortable.
But discomfort is where we make change, right? A caterpillar without its discomfort couldn't become a butterfly.
Exactly.
You need that. So it depends on what audience I'm talking about as to how much I engage, right? For me, the aquarium is a family audience, right? But if we were in a different setting, there are so many things that we would talk about. And there are so many things that I know everyone would appreciate it. But to explicate the brutality to young minds, to talk about the savagery, we have to, I think our children suffer enough right now. And we can scaffold them into an understanding of what this world is really about. We don't have to push them off the cliff into it. So when we have all adults, it's a different conversation altogether. Yeah.
I think that's a great way of looking at educating people into something they're maybe not ready to see, or maybe they're uncomfortable with seeing. But like you were mentioning, it's a celebration also, right? There's also all the community aspects and the good food and the music and the dancing, all of those kinds of things too to look at.
Yeah, look, when it came to Juneteenth, because I grew up celebrating this, right? But Juneteenth for me when I was growing up was very different. It was mostly the churches had Juneteenth celebrations, right? And they were usually really small. I'm from Central Texas, a small town called Killeen. So those celebrations were very small, and they weren't these huge things, except when we would make plans, the adults would make plans and take us to Houston. In Houston, they had this place called Emancipation Park. They still have it, I'm sorry. I've moved away from Texas so many years. They have this place called Emancipation Park. And Emancipation Park was a park that was a piece of land, it's a few acres, that was purchased in like 1872. And the person, this is a beautiful story. You're making me remember things. This is a beautiful story. There was we called him Pastor Yates, Pastor John Yates. I've heard people call him Jack, but I grew up, we didn't call our elders by their first name. So I grew up calling him Pastor Yates. But he organized a group of formerly enslaved people and purchased this land in Houston. And it was in 1872 or so. This is the site now where you'll find the biggest Juneteenth celebrations. You'll find them. But when I was growing up, sometimes there were a few people at the park. Sometimes it might be a smattering of a few people. Sometimes it was kind of big where you would see 50, 60, 100 people. Those were like the big Juneteenth celebrations to us. Nothing like what they look like today. But when we didn't go to Houston, most of our celebrations were small and somber. And we listened to the voices of the old people, the elders who were not that far removed from that period of enslavement or whose parents had been enslaved. We spent a lot of time that, and like I say, they were really religious in nature.
And that goes back to that oral tradition that you were talking about, right?
Right, right, because like this image here, okay? 2 African-American soldiers firing. This image comes out of Virginia, right? This isn't the image that is projected out to society for the most part. So when I was growing up, I knew about this. I'd seen these images. These were my relatives. These were people who I knew had fought for my freedom. So growing up, even though those Juneteenth celebrations were somber, they were religious in nature, they were informative. I was learning. So this is not foreign to me. Knowing that Black soldiers fought wasn't foreign to me. And I've been in classrooms when I was growing up with other African-American students who, when we start talking about enslavement or we start talking about that period, they slump down or they feel a little embarrassed because they weren't gifted with what I was gifted with growing up. So they don't understand that overcoming and surviving enslavement is the greatest narrative that any people could ever have. We are here, we survived, we fought. So for me, I want to express that during Juneteenth more than anything. And there's so much stuff coming to my brain. Am I boring y'all? I don't want to bore you. Are y'all okay? Okay.
If you're just coming in at the top of the theater, please feel free to find a seat. We're just really happy you guys want to join us today.
Yeah.
I have to say, you were telling me I should feel lucky talking to my great-grandfather, and I absolutely do, but I feel so incredibly lucky to sit here and talk to you because learning about different celebrations, different cultures, different stories, that's personally one of the things I love, so I'm feeling really spoiled today.
Wonderful. There is something I want to express, and I think this is the major thought, the major theme for me for this year, for Juneteenth, it is Black agency. It is recognizing that we fought. It is recognizing that we weren't these passive souls waiting for someone to free us. And one of the things I always want to put out is that no human being at any time, in any way, has ever seen themselves as anything other but free.
Right.
Surviving under oppressive conditions. That is what the human condition is. No one ever saw themselves as a slave. And if they did, they were a minority. Seeing themselves that way. That is just not the way human beings function. This is the image I was telling you about. This image gives me joy. This image gives me so much joy. These are formerly enslaved people. Now, when you look at this image, you see something, many of you might see something different than me. But I see the people who worked as spies. I see the people who worked as cooks, nurses. I see the people who worked as stevedores, who transported. I see something here that is magical to me. I see my family in this. I don't see passive people waiting for someone to come and bring them freedom. So for me, Juneteenth is a celebration. Like I said, freedom is different for everyone. Freedom for me has always been about resistance. When we landed on these shores, we started fighting. And when I was born, my fight started. And when I leave, the fight is going to continue with everyone else. We have never not been resistant to the condition. In fact, I would say that our resistance has helped this nation to move in a trajectory toward what it should be, what it professes in its ideals. I would say that we as African Americans have helped this nation to realize that, probably more than almost any people here. And I'm not taking anything away from the indigenous people or any of the other people here, but 240-something years of enslavement is marginalized in the minds of so many, and it is the foundation of this nation's economics, history, social structure. And until we start bringing it back into the conversation, we're not going to move that far. That's why we move incrementally until we're ready to have these honest conversations.
I think that's a really good point to make. And one of, I guess, maybe the easiest way to kind of see that is in music, right? Because where do we get R&B and rock and roll, jazz music? It's all from African American culture.
Yeah, and which has its roots in African culture. I was at a church this morning, and they brought me there to speak about Juneteenth. And when I went to Africa, the music I was learning was a lot of call and response. The music I learned growing up was a lot of call and response. So we were at this church, and we began to sing the song Freedom. I won't sing. Y'all don't want me to sing that song, do you? Y'all are smiling. If y'all sing it with me. No, we're okay. But we were singing the song Freedom. And it's a very emotional song for me because I grew up through the civil rights movement. But it's such an easy song to learn because of the call and response. But it's the same when I went back to Africa and I started learning the language, the culture over there. It's the exact same call and response, used in a different language, but it is the exact same thing. And the feeling, the immersion in the collective feeling of the moment is the exact same thing. It was fascinating to me. You know, I'm not an anthropologist, I'm a human being, but when I went there, just what I learned affirmed who I was here in this country.
I don't know, you say you're only a human being, but I would argue that every human being is a little bit of an anthropologist, I think, just a little bit. But I did notice that during our African American Festival, how important participation was in a lot of the music and dance performances we were lucky to see. So many people got called onto stage to dance or learn a new dance or help with the singing, and it was really, it felt like being welcomed into a family, and it was wonderful.
Yeah, more image soldiers. I want more of these images posted, graffiti, put everywhere. We need to see more African American soldiers. But this thing about participation. There was a study done once that said 80% of the world is what we would call collectivist cultures. Collectivists, or if we want to call them communal cultures. That's 80% of the people in this world live in communal or collectivist cultures. Only 20% of this world lives in what we call individualistic cultures. The 20%, individualistic cultures are a lot more aggressive, are seeking dominance, individualistic. Communal cultures seek a cohesion, right? In fact, this is what brings some of the insanity into our country here, is that we are a combination of communal and individualistic, collectivist and individualistic, right? And these things are constantly clashing together. Because in the communal culture, if you're not doing well, I'm not doing well. But in the individualistic culture, we have this archetype called the rugged individualist. And it's such a false archetype. It's that person who lifted themselves up on their own, they strived, and now they own everything.
Right.
But no one ever gets anywhere by themselves. So it's a false archetype, right? But that is what is deified for a lot in this culture, in this society. But the communal is what we praise, right? We say, don't be afraid to ask for help. We say, you know, we're all here together, we work together, right? But in many ways, we don't honor that as much as we should. We really gift and honor that the individualistic, that rugged individual archetype. And these people were anything but that. The idea, okay, I'm going on a rant. Okay. I hope I'm okay. There's just things coming to me that I need. I have had people say, you know what? I hear what you're saying, but you do know that Black people fought for the Confederacy as well. And that narrative has been put out there, right? It's a false narrative. And I know where it comes from. I know why it has been put out there. I understand that. But what you have to understand about the difference between the Union and the Confederacy at the time is the Union offered a promise of something that every human being craves: freedom. To think that African Americans or Black people fought against our own freedom is to look at us in a way not to recognize our humanity. Now, what I will offer people historically is that there were African Americans on the side of the Confederacy who were enslaved, who were forced to work for the Confederacy, and who were doing things for the Confederacy. And I would also say, if someone is shooting at you, you're going to shoot back, and there's
Exactly.
there's no political affiliation with, oh, I'm a Confederate, right? They didn't necessarily identify that way. And the other part of this is this, and this, I find this so ironic. Those who dig into their history, everyone knows when the Emancipation Proclamation was issued, it turned the tide of the war. January of 1865, it just shifted the tide. And ironically, the Emancipation Proclamation didn't free everyone. There were 4 states that had not seceded from the Union. Delaware, Missouri, Kentucky. Y'all help me out here. There were 4. We'll get to 4. Delaware, Kentucky, Missouri. I'll get the other one. But they hadn't seceded. So slavery was still legal in part of the Union with those states that had not seceded. So this idea of blacks fighting for the Confederacy is so far removed from reality that images have had to be doctored to say, here are some Confederate soldiers when they weren't Confederate soldiers. They were actually Union soldiers. They were stevedores like what I showed you. This idea we need to shift away from and recognize the humanity of people, that no one is going to fight against their own freedom. It just doesn't exist. We need a more nuanced approach to history, because when I deal in education, I deal with multiple perspectives. I deal with growth mindsets. I deal with global mindsets, which is what has offered me the opportunity to travel all over the world, to do what I do, to do this, to teach history in the way that I teach. We need more of that. We need so much more of that, because what I was taught growing up was that just because you think one way doesn't mean everyone is going to think the way you think.
Exactly.
So I am open and receptive, because even from the mouths of a child, like I said about that 5th grader, I was floored. I'm awed by people, I don't care how old you are, who speak like that.
Something you said has kind of been sticking with me while we've been talking. You mentioned everybody thinks of themselves as free. And you'll have to forgive me, I don't remember where I read this exchange, but it was an exchange between a white man and an African-American man. And the white man was, explaining, you have been freed, you have rights, you can do, whatever it is he was talking about. And I remember the response that was written was, you can't give me my rights, I have always had them. You have only just taken them away.
Right.
Which I thought was incredibly powerful.
Yeah, and part of what we engage is what I call, it's a form of cultural bigotry. Because if you approach another human being and you tell them, you're free now, and you have this and you have that, there's no inquiry there.
Right.
The appropriate thing to do among human beings is to approach and say, do you feel free? And then listen and engage that way. But cultural bigotry doesn't allow for that. Cultural bigotry takes offense at anyone expressing themselves outside of my comfort, outside of my zone, outside of my schema. The brain creates what's called a schema, right, from our lived reality. And we call it a bubble. We call it a bubble. Neurologists call it a schema. Anything that penetrates that schema that is not a part of my lived experience, it creates a discomfort, a cognitive dissonance. And many people, rather than embrace that cognitive dissonance and say, why am I feeling like this? I need to understand this, will act out in a way. And the part of the brain where this is happening, it's called an amygdala hijack, where you go into this and it won't make sense. You'll be looking at people and going, why are they acting like this? Why are they saying this? None of this makes sense. The sky is blue. We all see the sky is blue. Why don't we make, because the amygdala hijack takes you into fight, flight, flee, appease mode. And there's no rationing and there's no reasoning with that. So, it's breaking through people's bubbles, through people's schemas. That's why I call it cultural bigotry, because it's capable of being broken. We just all have to do it. It's not up to the African Americans or black people in this country to resolve all of the issues dealing with race. It's up to every human being here. It's the same thing with our celebrations of Juneteenth. If you understand freedom, like the 11-year-old said, if you understand the privilege of that, then you will celebrate Juneteenth. Anything that celebrates the freedom of human beings.
And it's, hey guys, you can come on in, find a seat if you'd like to join us. We're happy to have you. So sorry.
Okay.
And I've just completely lost my train of thought. I just got so into what you were saying.
It's okay. It's okay. I want to make sure that I honor here. Like, if I'm used to this, like if anyone had questions here, if you raise your hands and you have a question here, I'll call on you because I'm used to us being a collective. So don't hesitate if anyone here has any questions. Yeah, maybe you can watch out for them because your eyes are younger than mine, so you can actually see people. I don't see so well. So.
Oh, I remember what I was talking about. You were saying that it's up to everybody to help, bring us forward and move forward. And I was going to add to that, it's not just the one instance, it's a practice. We have to keep working at it, keep getting better and holding ourselves accountable. And like you said, it's not going to be comfortable, but as long as you can try your best and keep moving, I'd say that's something to keep in mind.
Yeah, I remember one of my heroes was Malcolm X, I'm sorry. Everyone knows him as Malcolm X. When I was growing up, he was one of my heroes. And I remember he had went to Harvard to deliver a speech at Harvard. And there was a young white woman who came up to him, and this was an early period in his life. And this young white woman came up to him and she said, I want to support what you're doing. I think what you're doing is incredible. What can you do to support what I'm doing? And at the time, Malcolm looked at her and he said, there's nothing you can do for me. And they walked away. They separated. He says, because I'm going to help myself. I don't need your help. This was an early part of his life where he was engaging this way. And I remember listening to a speech he gave on a regret that he had over that moment. Because when people are motivated and energized and willing to put energy behind thought, we can shift things. We can change a lot of things. And I think that regret I have had in my life. Growing up, what I had to witness down south, no human being should ever have to witness the things that I or any young person down south had to deal with. My children growing up, they don't even know about many of the things that I had to go through down south. But I wanted to protect them from that. Now, in saying that, I also realized that when Malcolm told that young woman what he told her, I understand where that was coming from. It comes from a place of pain. It's not, we like to look and say, well, there's that angry black man. Anger is a form of hurt. When human beings are hurt, they lash out in different ways. And not to allow everyone to have the spectrum of emotion and human thought and processing is detrimental. And early in my life, I did the same thing Malcolm did as far as telling people that, because it angered me that no one knew these images but me. But now that I've gotten a lot older and I've been all over the world, many of the people who have had my back have not looked like me. And when I say had my back, I mean really had my back. And I have to acknowledge that because the world is different. Sometimes we get stuck here, in these contiguous U.S. states, and we think this is the world.
Right.
And we do not live in the world. The world lives around us, but there is so much more to it than what we see.
Well, it goes back to what you were saying about community, right? And being comfortable asking for help and even being comfortable maybe knowing that you actually will get the help if you ask for it.
Yeah, the greatest gift I ever got in my life was knowing that I don't know. That was the greatest gift I ever got. When I was in school, growing up in Texas, of all places, Texas is one of the most misunderstood states in the country. There are people in Texas fighting, right, for the recognition of the humanity of all people. But I was growing up, I had a teacher, and I never will forget this. This was in the 70s. Oh my gosh, I'm old. This is in the 70s. And the ERA, Equal Rights Amendment, we were fighting for that. And I was with my mother, and there was like the feminist movement, and like equal rights amendment. How could you not have equal rights for all people? And, I'm a teenager. So I'm like, I'm on fire, fighting for the equal rights. Women deserve equal rights, women deserve equal, and I'm on fire. So I was on the debate team. And I had this teacher, I'll never will forget this. She said, we're going to debate the ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment. And I'm like, yes. And she said, you're going to debate opposition of it.
Oh, no. The exact
and I was
opposite
like,
of what
wait,
you wanted, right?
You want me to debate against the Equal Rights Amendment? You want me to debate that women should not, and it blew my mind that she would have me do this because I was ready to win. Mm-hmm. Needless to say, I lost that debate. I lost because I, at that time, was passionate, right? But it taught me a valuable lesson. Even though I may not agree, I still can delve into the perspectives of others to see things from their angle, to try to understand where they're coming from. Now, I don't have to agree with it, and I can still be passionate about fighting against you, but I am required as a human being to understand, to attempt to understand. In my youth, that I wasn't trying to understand. I was just angry. Like, how dare you have me debate? But it shifted. That teacher helped me, and this is in Texas, right? That teacher helped shift a lot in me that I still carry with me to this day. And I would say at that time, I learned more from that teacher than I did in college or university.
Funny how those things stick with you.
Oh.
Now, I don't mean to be abrupt in changing the subject because I could talk to you about this for hours, but we are getting close to our end time. So if you would like to go over them, I wanted to talk about what you brought here in the middle for us.
Okay, I will talk about that.
Sure.
If
okay.
You make sure we have a little time left, because I want to play again.
Absolutely.
I want to share a story. I want to share something a little more. I want people to walk out feeling as though they had the time that they sacrificed to be here, all of you, that I honored it. So I'll talk about this if you let me do that.
Oh, easy deal. You got it.
Okay, these are fly whisk. Mm-hmm. And fly whisk were equivalent to, in ancient West Africa, a gavel, a judge's gavel. So usually the elders would carry these in their right hand, and certain waving of them would mean certain things. And they were honored because it would take hours to talk about the whole thing, but here's the thing to understand the most. In order for us to live, there's a recognition that something has to give up its life, whether it's a plant, whether it's another animal. And we need to recognize that in order for us to be who we are, something has to sacrifice. So in a lot of ways, this is honoring the memory of sacrifice. So every time you put a bit of food in your mouth, every time you consume something, you don't consume it for the joy of consuming. You consume it recognizing that something gave up its life. So
kind of like showing a bit of gratitude for the sacrifice made. Yeah.
Honoring, right. And every culture has it. It's funny. Okay, I get to work. My work takes me through Jewish temples, mosques, Catholic churches, schools, corporate institutions, aquariums. I get to work in all of these places. And I remember I was in a Catholic school once, and I told them about this and how the elders would say words over the dead body of the animal so that its spirit could go off and be in peace, and how they kept the tale to remember that something sacrificed its life. And I asked these children in this Catholic school, have you ever heard of anything like this before? And all the children were like, no. And I said, before you eat your food, do you say words over the food? And they were nodding, just like you're nodding now. And I said, why? And they began to say this, and they all went, oh! And I said, yeah. You see, in this world, we have more in common than different. It may be dressed differently. It may look differently. It may carry a different language. It may smell differently. But we all are carrying our humanity with us, and we express it in similar but aesthetically different ways.
How special to be able to see that moment of connection. when you were explaining that.
Yeah, sometimes they call it, there's a term for it, the curse of consciousness.
Great way
When
to
you're
put it.
aware of history and it's intimate and you're connected to it and you feel it. But I think the reason why I was born feeling it so much is so that I could share it.
Well, before you play, I just want to say thank you to everybody here who's joined us. Thank you to everybody on our live stream. A lot of what we try to do here at the Aquarium of the Pacific is learn about each other so that we can work together towards, protecting our environment and the places we live, and that means so much to us. So we really are grateful that you all were able to join us and for Baba joining us as well. So thank you so much.
Can I tell a little story?
Of course you can.
Okay. I want to play a little bit for you. This song that I'm going to play is over 800 years old.
Oh my gosh.
It's over 800 years old. And it was one of the first songs I learned on the Kora, which is why I play it so much when I tell stories. But I'm going to be singing some of the words. Okay, email me, text me, or get me on social media if you're like, hey, what were you saying? Okay, so hit me up on social media and you'll find me, Baba the Storyteller. I'm like the first 5 pages of Google. That's how long I've been around. So I just want to play this and let's see where it goes. Backyard of her home, and she's just standing there. In each of her hands, she has an apple, 2 apples, one in each hand. So she's standing there in her backyard with these 2 apples, and her mother sees her through the window. Her mother decides she's going to test her because this is what parents do. Parents test their children. She wanted to see if her daughter had learned the kindness she had tried to impart to her. So the mother goes out to the backyard and she goes to the little girl. And she says to her daughter, she says, oh, I see you have 2 apples. And the little girl, she looks in one hand and the other and she says, So the mother looks at the little girl and she says, oh, those apples look so delicious. The little girl looks at the one in her left hand, her right hand, she goes, And here comes the test. The mother looks at the little girl and she says to her, she says, may I have one of those apples? And the little girl takes the apple in her right hand and she bites into it and starts chewing. And she takes the apple in her left hand and she bites into it and she's chewing. And her mother can't believe this. Her mother is thinking, I taught my daughter better than this. I can't believe my daughter is doing this. The mother is looking at her daughter and she's thinking, I taught my daughter to be kind, generous, to share. If she will do this to her mother, what will she do in the world? And the mother, actually, let's be honest, the mother is getting angry, upset with her daughter. And then she's about to open up her mouth and tell her daughter how disappointed she is in her. And at that point, when she opens her mouth, before she says anything, the little girl holds up the apple in her right hand and says, here, mommy, this one is for you. It's the sweetest one.
Oh.
I share that story because what I've learned in traveling the world is that most people are always trying to offer the sweet stuff. Very rarely do you meet people It may look different. It may be dressed different. It may come with a different language. But most of us in this world are always trying to offer the sweetest stuff. Those who aren't are the minority. I think we give way too much energy to the minority. I think when we walk around in this world, we need to recognize not only that people are trying to offer us the sweetest apple, but we should also do the same. Yeah, Charlie, Thank you. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you, everybody. I think that is our time, but yes, thank you everybody so much for being here. We really appreciate it. And we hope you enjoy the rest of your visit here at the aquarium today. Thank you again.
Thank you all. This was an honor. Thank you for being here today.